Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping straight into one of the most high-stakes, gripping political chess matches in modern African history. The year is 2001, the setting is Kenya, and the political landscape, well, it looks completely sealed. Literally, if you were looking at the board at this exact moment, you would think the game was already over. But as we're about to see, what looks like complete defeat can sometimes be the perfect cover for an absolute masterstroke.
Okay, let's dive into this. The situation was incredibly bleak for the man at the center of our story, Mwai Kibaki. He's sitting in his taxpayer-funded office holding the title of leader of the official opposition. Now sure, it sounds like a grand title. He had a shadow cabinet, a budget, dedicated staff, the whole shebang. But in reality, it was an office with absolutely zero raw political power. His Democratic Party, which had carried his presidential ambitions in the past, was hemorrhaging members and public faith at an alarming rate. Honestly, it was getting brutal. In the crowded bars and political gatherings over in Nairobi, voters were openly mocking the party. The running joke was that the letters DP no longer stood for Democratic Party, but for Dead Party.
To really understand why the opposition was losing hope, we have to look at the other side of the board. President Daniel Arap Moi had been ruling for 23 years. He was the ultimate professor of Kenyan politics, systematically neutralizing every single threat to his authority. The political board was locked tight, and the keys seemed to be thrown far out into the Indian Ocean. Facing an incumbent with that level of entrenched power made the odds of any opposition victory seem, quite frankly, mathematically and politically impossible.
Which brings us to our first major turning point, the grand merger.
While the opposition was basically in despair, an inciting incident across the aisle made the ruling party appear completely invincible. Raila Odinga, a fiery leader who commanded the fiercely loyal Luo Nyanza voting bloc, did the unthinkable. He moved away from traditional opposition hostility and actually entered a strategic cooperation agreement with Moi's ruling party, KANU. So, in June 2001, Moi appoints Raila as Minister for Energy. Fast forward to March 2002, and this arrangement culminates in a total party merger in front of thousands of cheering delegates at Kasarani Stadium. Raila's NDT was officially swallowed up into KANU to form what was called New KANU, and Raila himself snatched up the Secretary General position of this massive new machine.
The immediate result of this merger? Devastating. 140 out of 222. With Raila's forces absorbed into the ruling machine, New KANU's numbers in parliament ballooned overnight. They now controlled nearly 140 of the 222 seats. The opposition wasn't just losing anymore. They were outgunned, outmanned, and mathematically suffocated in the legislative branch.
And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering contrast at this specific moment in history. On one side, you have New KANU, bloated with numbers, controlling the cabinet, and publicly boasting that they're going to comfortably rule for another 20 years. State House insiders were whispering that Kibaki's political career was completely finished. On the flip side, you have the opposition, fractured, hemorrhaging members, isolated into regional enclaves, and absolutely plagued by divided egos. It looked like they were already writing their concession speeches.
But inside that weakened resistance, there were three flickering flames holding the line.
Understanding these three key figures is absolutely crucial to what happens next. First, you have Mwai Kibaki of the Democratic Party. He's this respected, brilliant elder statesman, but he's widely criticized as being way too quiet, too cautious to jump into political brawls. Then there's Mwai Kijana Wamalwa of Ford, Kenya, a silver-tongued debater commanding massive Buksu support, but his party is fracturing from internal squabbles. And finally, Charity Kaluki Ngilu of the NPK. She has this fierce grassroots charisma, fondly known as Mama Sa, but her base is relatively small. So what do they all have in common? Well, their fatal flaw. Their support, while incredibly powerful, is entirely localized and regionalized. Standing individually, literally none of them have a viable path to State House.
And history proved this for sure. If we look back at the 1992 and 1997 elections, the opposition's true enemy wasn't necessarily just the ruling party. It was their own ego. By running as divided opposition candidates, they continuously split the vote, effectively handing President Moi victory on a silver platter, even when the ruling party only secured a minority of the total vote.
To change the outcome, they had to change their entire approach, and that brings us to the secret breakfasts.
So the crucial point is that Kibaki recognized surprise was their ultimate weapon. Beginning in late 2001, discreet invitations were sent out. The three leaders began meeting in these incredibly low-key, closed-door breakfast caucuses at the Nairobi Hilton Hotel.
This was completely hidden away from the media frenzy, a massive stark contrast to those loud public stadium rallies of New KANU. They just sat around conference tables, flanked only by highly trusted advisors like Beth Mugo and Kipruto Arap Kirwa.
Inside those rooms, they hashed out a revolutionary mandate to solve their fatal flaw. First, they had to sink their individual party identities. Second, they had to forego personal egos. And third, they had to agree on a single, unified opposition candidate to face KANU in 2002. Now, in politics, convincing leaders to give up their individual spotlight is incredibly difficult, almost impossible, but they recognized it was literally their only viable strategy for survival.
Let's move to and see how this builds into a political shockwave. In early 2001, we saw complete opposition despair, but by late 2001, they're quietly organizing at the Hilton Hotel. Then, they take the massive step of going public at Dagoretti, which culminates in the early 2002 official launch of their unified vehicle, NAC. This escalating momentum happened right under the noses of the ruling party.
The moment this secret plot finally burst into the public view was stunning. It happened late in 2001 at a bursary fundraiser at the Ndarawa grounds in Dagoretti. Mwai Kibaki, the guy KANU insiders thought was just going to quietly retire, stepped right up to the microphone and addressed a stunned crowd. He declared, "In January, we will announce a single opposition presidential candidate. We are holding a series of meetings because Kenyans are looking at us with hope, and we must form a unified front."
That public announcement formalized the creation of NAC, the National Alliance Party of Kenya. And the absolute key word to remember here is structured. This wasn't just some loose, shaky gentleman's agreement. No, for the first time in Kenya's multi-party history, the Democratic Party, Ford Kenya, and NPK united under a sturdy, structural political umbrella. They were intentionally building a container strong enough to handle the massive political shockwaves they knew were right around the corner.
Which brings us to the dramatic irony of this entire situation. The trap is set.
You see, KANU strategists looked at this newly formed NAC and just arrogantly dismissed it outright. They figured it was just a desperate coalition of regional players who would instantly turn on each other the moment they actually had to pick that single candidate. But they failed to realize one crucial thing. By operating quietly, Kibaki, Wamalwa, and Gilu had built a firm structural foundation. They had essentially constructed an invisible trap, a waiting political container, specifically designed to catch the fallout from a bloated, overconfident ruling party that was about to make a massive miscalculation.
Kibaki, the quiet, cautious elder statesman, had played the underdog perfectly. He built this unified alliance while his opponents were toasting to their own perceived victory. And across town, inside State House, President Moi was preparing to make a fateful, unilateral decision about his successor. A decision that was destined to completely fracture his newly acquired super party and send political heavyweights running straight toward the very trap Kibaki had built. The pieces are on the board, the trap is fully set, so who would step into it first? That is the fascinating question we are left with, and it's exactly what sets the stage for the incredibly dramatic events of 2002.